Logging inside of a .NET application is very important, and there's a number of ways to log correctly, but there's also a number of ways to log incorrectly. And the way I like to think about this is in the context of an essay or maybe just a book. We've all picked up books that have been maybe a little bit longer than what they maybe needed to have been, and essays that have contained a lot of filler or fluff to meet in order to meet some arbitrary word count. And sometimes logs can be guilty of committing the same error in the sense that it's possible to log too much information, therefore making it that much harder to decipher what the important parts of the logs are. And if you rely too much on filters, especially complex filters, in order to figure out the necessary bits of information from your logs, then I think it warrants a second look at what information you're logging to begin with. Because if you just have thousands and thousands of lines or pages or rows in your database capturing logs, and you either rarely look at them or you have to perform really complex filters in order to figure out what the important parts are, then I think that you need to scale back how much you're logging. And logging is a little bit of an art because up front, when you're making the code or you're writing the code or making the system, it's easy to kind of fall into the trap of feeling like you need to over log in the beginning. Meaning in .NET, you could log, what request was called, what the responses look like, um, what you're doing to the data, the response, and all of a sudden you have written 5 to 10 logs per request. And if you scale that up by a million requests, you have a lot of logs that might not be capturing that important information to begin with. And whatever logging system you're using, all that space comes at a cost. And if you're using a logging provider that's in the cloud, if you're using a logging provider by way of a database, if you're using maybe even just a text file output of your logs, all that's going to come at a cost of space in terms of how large the file is, or cost in terms of, okay, how much space do we have to pay in order to store these logs. And also, actually, a third, if we can add on to it, is the speed by which you're able to query into your logs. And that's a very important one because if you are trying to figure something out, the last thing you want to have to do is sift through just meaningless and just nonsense, just log statements that just mean absolutely nothing. So it really is important to clean up your logs, but also ask yourself, what questions are we trying to answer with the logs? And I would argue that this is the responsibility of the developers, but also the product owners, because that they're the ones that are supposed to be guiding the products, and arguably they're the ones that you should be talking to in order to get answers to a lot of the more like business oriented questions, or the questions that you're trying to ask, when you're looking at the data. And so if your logs are failing to answer questions or failing to answer really anything, then I think that it warrants a sprint or multiple stories to go back and actually make a serious, concerted effort to honestly refactor the log statements to make them good. And I'm not just talking about using structured logs to, to make them searchable based on terms. I'm not just talking about, taking advantage of indexes. I'm talking about making them readable to us, to people, and to making it readable in the sense that we don't have to doom scroll through logs. And arguably, it's almost like logs get treated as like the unit test of the development world, meaning like, obviously nobody likes to write unit tests, but it's just something that we do in order to, I'm not going to go into it. We all know why we write tests. But logs, I feel like, kind of fall into that same category a little bit, where it's like they kind of get put off, and I feel like they need to be more upfront in the overall design, because once you let logs kind of guide your thought process and really guide your decision making about the code because you know ahead of time what questions you're trying to solve through the logs, then I really feel like that changes everything. Because what's better? What's better to log the simple fact that you called an endpoint, or should we log maybe what the data in our engine, if that endpoint is called a specific number of times because the engine had a temperature that's too high. And so the more granular you can get with whatever information you're trying to log, it's hard to make a hypothetical right now because we're not looking at data. But if you figure out that, I think that changes everything. And I think it makes you a little bit less reliant also on the specific logging provider that you're using and the complex filters that you have to add in to make the logs meaningful. Because logs in and of themselves, I think should be meaningful. But if they're not meaningful by themselves, is there a point to them? And you can get a little bit more granular based on whatever logging level you choose for your environment. If you're in production and you'd only want to log, the warning level and above, that's good. But if you're in development and you're logging everything from debug and above, obviously there's going to be a difference there. But even if you haven't set to warning, but you're logging everything as informational or debug anyway, then it's a problem because you're not going to capture that. So I think that it warrants a deeper discussion about, okay, what log level are we going to use for our environment? What are we trying to accomplish with the log statements? I think it warrants calling out pull requests when there needs to be additional logs in place for whatever actions we're doing. But also, I think that you, I really think that it forces us to ask ourselves the question: are the logs doing anything different than what the code is saying? Because logs are our one opportunity to write just plain text, however we want it. It's a sentence to describe and answer something that is happening in code. But if the logs are as abstract and just complicated and just hard to follow, like the code is, then is it doing anything? I mean, that's the question that needs to be addressed. Logging is such a difficult thing to get right because it's a lot of configuration, right? And it just is something that I feel like just falls by the wayside a lot of times. But if you have really good and sophisticated logs, it's going to make debugging the system and any errors you get that much easier because you've thought about it already. Unit tests and integration tests and all the tests, they're not going to capture everything. It's inevitable that you're going to have to, at some point, sift through the logs and figure out what the problem is. And the more you think about that, the more you visualize yourself down the road, sitting at your computer, scrolling through the log file, whatever the logging provider, whatever it may be, trying to figure out, okay, what went wrong. The more you can picture yourself doing that, I think the better you're going to, the better quality log you're going to write because you want to avoid that scenario. And the worst is when you don't put enough thought into logs and then you have to rely on like you have to rely on either your instance's system log wherever your application is deployed, and then things just get messy there because let's face it, the timestamps might be different, and it just gets to be a real headache very quickly. But everyone who's worked in software development knows exactly what I'm talking about when it comes to logs. And you know, I just it's it, the more I think about it, it just is hard. It's honestly like I think that logs should be something that are brought up in an interview or like asked about, like, because I think they're so important. Like, I get, okay, in an interview, like, all right, cover the, depending on what level it is, cover the basics, right? You got syntax and you got, can you make a API, describe all that stuff. But maybe there needs to be a question about just describe your philosophy of logging. Talk about a time when you looked at bad logs. Maybe that would be a good conversation. I don't know, but does that make sense, man? It's a hard thing to talk about, but maybe I'll try to make some content on logs and .NET or something. But I don't know. That's all I got for this one. I'll see you in the next one.